Amazing. We're live. Welcome, James.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I love this podcast is I have excuses to talk to friends, and James is one of them. And yeah, before we get started, I just want to embarrass James a little bit. Just say that I really admire him. I met him through Supra. He's an incredible product leader. He's worked at great companies like YouTube, Stripe. But I think, he's also like, you have a lot of kind of dimensions to you. Like you're also a super present dad, which I think kind of you and Ben have in common. Um, you're a great thinker and writer. I love like kind of your yearly write-ups about like the things that I learned this year. But I think that one of the coolest things about you, James, is that you're not afraid to do like unconventional stuff. And I think that's part of why we're having this conversation today. And I also forgot to mention, you've also been a founder at a cool seaweed company too. So it's like you've done a lot. But one of the latest unconventional stages that you've done is you did an externship at Roo Code, taking a hybrid PM and go-to-market role. And for those not familiar, I mean, James will get into more detail probably later, but it's basically, you can think of Roo Code as like competitor to Cloud Code or Codex, and they're doing really cool stuff. And the reason why, when you told me this, I was like, okay, we should have this conversation, is because I think there's a lot of dialogue out there around what it means to be AI native. And I think people don't really get it. Like, I feel like when I tell them, hey, like it's really important to understand how that's changing, a lot of people are like, oh, like, but I use AI tools at work. And I'm like, no. Like AI native companies just like operate at a completely different level. So my goal for this podcast is like show rather than tell, like really bring someone who has lived that and can share how different it is and share their live experience, but also have an honest like reflection about there's some things that are really good and some things that are half baked that are not working. So if we can accomplish all of that, I think it's going to be a banger of an episode. So yeah, maybe James, let's start with like, tell us a little bit more about Roo Code and the team and yeah, let's start there.
Yeah. So Roo Code is awesome. They are a model agnostic AI coding agent, which means you can work with Roo Code and use Gemini, OpenAI, Opus, whichever model provider that you like. And they are really leaning into this vision that in the future, the AI is going to write the code and the human is going to direct the AI. And one of the things that sets them apart is that when you have Roo properly configured, it is going to ask you way less questions. It's going to ask you for permission way less often than Claude or OpenAI, intentionally, so that you can offload more of the work onto the agent. And then one of the things that actually made me want to go and work with the team is that they believe that core to their success is going to be reinventing ways of working around what it means to be an AI-focused team. And so everyone on their team codes. The community manager is one of the most productive members of the team as far as pull requests merged or tokens used. And they believe that for them to win, they have to invent this new style of working. And that's part of what made it a really valuable experience to go and see. And I would say a lot of things are really working, and then some things are not working. And their team was handling those things in really interesting ways too. So it was absolutely a fantastic experience.
So when we say everyone, I want everyone to know you're not using that as an exaggeration. I think you really do mean 100% of the team. How big is the team?
Team is about 10 people.
10 people.
There were engineers, product people, designers, community managers, marketing people. We had some part-time marketing people come through. And so if they wanted to change the marketing copy or the images on the website, they were using the Roo Code agent to make those changes.
Got it. So the main code bases that people were contributing to were like the marketing website, and then obviously there's like the core code base for like it's a little bit meta, but like they would contribute code by using the tool to the code base that governs the tool that they're actually using to contribute the code.
Yeah, so let's talk about surfaces a little bit, and this can get a little confusing, but I do think it'll make the rest of the conversation easier. So Roo is a VS Code. Roo's first product was a VS Code extension, and this is open source. So this is, if you're in the IDE, if you've downloaded VS Code, you can install these extensions that live by default on the left-hand side. You can move them around. And Roo was built off of another open source project called Klein. They forked it and created an experience that was much more, allowed you to put more responsibility on the AI agent for coding. and really resonated with the community. They could just saw a pop of like enthusiasm and growth, and that's the business was born out of that. And they have since added a web experience, a cloud experience that complements what you're able to do in the IDE. And that is, of course, not open source. And that's where, the majority of the revenue is today. And people were contributing, as a product GTM salesy type person, I was making contributions to the VS Code extension, as well as the web app, as well as the docs, all of those different services.
Got it. Okay. So the people, when we say that everyone on the team contributes code, we don't mean that everyone contributes codes to all of the surfaces, but to either the website or the kind of like core, I guess, like extension code base, or the cloud code base for like the core experience. And then maybe some people contribute to all of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or multiple.
I mean, it depends on your work, right? Like, your work might take you more in one direction or the other. But certainly if your job required you to do it, it required a code change, you were going to at least try to do it yourself. And then absolutely there were, one of the interesting things about the experience, you kind of go in and you hear that and you're like, okay, what's the role of engineering, or design or product? And in my experience, actually, people that were really strong designers or really strong engineers were actually more valuable in this world, because if a ops person for the company is going to be committing code, it really, really helps them to have a strong design pattern to be working off of, right? And so that ability to create design patterns or design systems that are high leverage and useful for the entire team is even more impactful. Like, you might not need that person at a startup until you're a fairly large company. I remember, I worked at companies with 500 or 600 engineers that didn't really have a design systems team. Well, now all of a sudden we're getting real leverage out of that person as a 10-person startup, because you're not having to reinvent the wheel, right? And the cost of cruft is like, because you have more people coding of various skill levels, you might have more cruft that's seeping into the product. And same thing on the engineering side, right? Like the really, really talented, the CTO and the really, really talented engineers on the team were providing people like me even more leverage, because they were building in systems that we didn't have to rethink from scratch when we wanted to make more user-facing code changes.
Yeah, I think it's, as someone who's like that technical or that gifted from a design perspective, I think it's intellectually probably way more interesting to operate at that level of abstraction, as opposed to like just like, and also from like an impact perspective, right? It's like, oh, I'm not only just making code better, but I'm empowering people under me to be more productive. I definitely want to get into the product process of Roo Code. But before we do that, as you were describing that, man, I was like, I can just put myself in kind of your shoes of like the first day and being like, holy shit, I'm so afraid to do a PR, because what if I break this amazing product that like has thousands of users? So like, can you maybe walk me through like, what are some interesting things that they did in the onboarding to like get past that fear of like, oh, holy shit, I'm actually merging into the main code base? Yeah, how did that work?
Yeah, the onboarding was pretty light. I mean, this is a very early stage company, and how could they have systems? They're a 10-person team. So I actually think that's one of the places where you might want to be thinking about this. There is a change management piece to this that you want to get through. The other thing that made it complicated was that I think if Roo had been just a web app, I would have been actually pretty confident in my ability to like get in there and do things. But like, it took me a little while to understand what the extension was. I'd never worked on a VS Code extension before, and that I had much more fear of like breaking, or like, it took me a little while to build my mental model of what that was. And once I did, things got a lot easier. But yeah, I mean, look, I think that's a place. I'm thinking a lot about developer tools right now. And part of the reason I'm thinking a lot about developer tools right now is that I think we're seeing a lot of changes in how developer tools are going to be used. And so like, just as an example, GitHub is going to get hit with a lot more pull requests than they did in the old world. And managing those pull requests, it's going to look and feel different. The Roo team was already seeing this. It sort of breaks at a certain point because it has gotten way less expensive to make pull requests. And so that sort of changes what you want it to do. And so, yeah, I mean, look, I found myself wading through a bunch of like engineering tools that I've never worked as an engineer on a team. right? I've only ever coded things for myself. And there was a learning curve for sure. And if I do that again, next time I will have way less fear around being like, okay, I'm just going to run, I'm going to let them reject my pull request if they don't like it. But like, let's go and make mistakes.
Yeah, maybe going on a little of a tangent for a sec, just like, because you mentioned it, like you mentioned, it's an interesting observation that kind of the way the current GitHub flow kind of breaks with this new world. Is the reason for that because there's just way more PRs, and then you just don't want to spend like that legendary CTO or really good engineer basically reviewing like PRs that have been coded by an agent. That just feels like low leverage. So how do you fix that, or is there something else to that breaks?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've seen, and I've seen this both at Roo and then also in personal projects that I've worked on, is that the cost of a PR has gone down a lot. And so 2 ways that this actually shows up. One is that if you're prototyping, your code changes might be a lot more substantial than they were in the past, because you can set a coding, it can churn through a lot of code really, really quickly. And actually in a prototyping stage, actually that may not necessarily be a bad thing. But then now, if you're treating that as precious in the review stage, are you going to ask somebody to read thousands of lines of code change for a prototype? Like, okay, whoa, what are we doing here, right? Like, is that necessary or not? Okay, that's one. And then 2 is like just the number of pull requests. And one of the things I think that makes Roo unique is that they do have an open source community that's working on some of the products. So some of the noise they're already familiar with, but then they had a bot, you can check it out at Roo Code's GitHub, that every time somebody opens a GitHub issue, the Roo agent will go and try and fix it. And some percent, I think they've said publicly 30% of the time or so, they're actually able to merge the fix. Now, okay, well, it depends on how good the initial issue is. Like, there's a lot going on in that 30%. But it is interesting to then think about, okay, who's actually going to like pay attention to these things? Who's going to like read through them? Who's going to merge them? And how many of them are there, right? And just that I think is the big change.
I was actually having breakfast last week with a friend of mine who runs like a pretty profitable bootstrapped open source kind of like productivity tool, and used to get, call it, I don't know, some baseline of contributions from the open source community to his tool. And he would, like review every PR and merge some, ignore some, send feedback. But he appreciated that people were basically making his tool better through open source contributions. And he said, because it's so easy to create these PRs now, people are submitting like massive PRs, like, to your point, hundreds, sometimes thousands of lines of code. And he's like, I'm not going to review that. And he's like, I don't think anyone else is going to review it either. So he's actually having to think through almost like adding permissions and like gating who can submit PRs for his open source project, because it's like an unintended consequence or implication of what we're talking about.
It's a great example. And then one of the things that I'm starting to think about a little bit is the software of the future going to be just malleable so you could decompose let's take a product like a HubSpot that's like a CRM, right? Is HubSpot a UI that people can touch and feel? Or is it a set of like databases and rights that are given where a user can apply any skin to, right? So HubSpot is pretty composable today. You can set up your own sales, stages. You can kind of manipulate the UI, but like how far actually do we end up taking that? Does the UI system of the future actually put all of that in the hands of every single customer? Would you allow customers to extend the product by default, and then like it gets really weird really quickly? And I think some of these constraints that we've had were baked into the idea that software was expensive and hard to change, and that you could break it, and I don't know how much that is going to be true in 24 months.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm getting a taste of that. I'm a customer of HubSpot, and I use it with the ChatGPT MCP, and I feel a lot of times I go there first, be like, hey, like, what are some quote unquote deals that are in trouble, or like, hey, how did the different like membership people did this week? And it's honestly a lot faster, and it gets information faster than if I had to go and go to a deal pipeline and filter and trying to get that information. So I'm totally with you. Yeah. So maybe now bring it back to the conversation to like the product process, right? And how that product process works for Roo Code. I think probably what would be interesting is like maybe go through like the different stages. I don't know how much do we want to cut it, but like maybe like and just kind of compare the before, like traditional product process versus like like AI native product process. Maybe we can start with like kind of like the discovery part of it, of like kind of like, hey, I have a hypothesis, or I think that we should explore this. Like, yeah, let's start there and see where we go.
Yeah, well, so I'd say there was a lot that was the same, and there also was a lot that was different. And so if you start with the process as kind of as it has existed in the past, first you need to have kind of a set of ideas or something that you want to go and pull on. So you might say, look, the business problem that we're trying to solve is that we want to increase signups, and we have a couple of different ways that we do that. And then maybe you then say, okay, I want to look at the onboarding flow, because I think the onboarding flow is too complicated. It's too hard to get from I found you to completing my first task on Roo. In the old world, I think what I would do as a PM is I would start to think about, a couple of different ways of solving that. I'd have a conversation with my designer, a conversation with my eng lead. I start to build a PRD. So you go from, okay, what's the problem we're trying to solve, to what's our approach to solving the problem, to the nitty gritty details. And you're going then from like the roadmap to the PRD to the design to a feature flagged version that people can kind of pick at. That's the basic process. For a lot of things during my time at Roo, all of the upfront stuff was happening either in team meetings or in Slack chats, right? Here, I really think it should be easier to get started. I think I'm going to spend some time working on that, right? Okay, that's going to be my focus for this week, is going to be making it easier to get started. And then you're actually coming with a pull request that has a and the way that their environment was set up, you'd get a Vercel link with that pull request, and you would come, and it might be rough, but you would come with that link, and you basically say, okay, this is what I think a better onboarding process could look like, and here's how this would work, and like, what do you guys think? And so now you've sort of had a conversation.
And by the way, James, how much time is there between like you had that Slack chat of like, hey, I think I should work on this week, to like submitting that pull request with the Vercel link?
It totally depends on the problem. I mean, look, for something that it could be hours, it could be less than an hour, depending on what it is, right? And depending on the risk and how many people need to weigh in on making a change. It could also be a week or two, right? You might have a conversation on Friday and then not be able to pick something up until later. And certainly, I think one of the things that I really appreciated about the Roo team is how intentional Danny, the CEO, Matt, the CTO, Bruno, who's in like a design product role, really, really thoughtful guys. And the company was trying to find the right words for when certain things were needed. And I think there were times actually that something that looks like a PRD or looks like a spec was useful. I mean, it's particularly when you were getting into features are in or out for the pro plan versus the free plan. And what does it mean for this particular feature to not be available on free? Does that mean you can't access it at all? Does that mean you can access part of it, but not all of it? And like creating a sense of common language around those things. Like sometimes it was easier in a doc than with a link, but we didn't always, like in the old world, you always wrote the doc first, right? Like there was no debate about that. And in the new world, it wasn't totally clear, like when do you write a doc and when do you when do you just go and code, and when is that helpful and when does that actually slow things down some? So I would say on the whole, things move more quickly, even, adjusting for company size, right? Like, startups tend to move a little bit more quickly than places like YouTube or even, don't tell Patrick, but even Stripe. But even adjusting for that, my sense is that you're taking days, if not weeks, out of the process in most cases, because somebody is bringing bringing something that people can touch and feel. And then there were times where you, as a producty or designy person, would bring something, and then somebody with more of an engineering background would actually take it over the finish line and to add the polish and make sure that the security model was properly respected and all of that stuff.
And where does the discovery work live, right? Like, because I'm assuming like there's some small features where, because everyone is a developer, you have that intuition of like, I think, this makes sense, we should fix it. But I'm sure there's other ones where like, okay, like there's something wrong, but you need to go talk to customers deeper, like, and then you have to take, hey, like, here are the insights from the conversation, and here's my hypothesis or what I think we should do next based on that. Like, those conversations, that information, where is that captured? Is that also like a Slack chat, or
is it a folder? Is it in a folder in the repo? Yeah, like where?
Yeah,
I'm also curious.
Yeah. So most of that stuff at Roo did not happen within the repo, because a decent part of the Roo repo is open source and is public. So you don't necessarily want to share every single one of those things with everyone on the internet, including the competitors. There's a Roo competitor who I won't name. That's their specific strategy is taking all of the open source coding agents, slurping in all of their features, and then giving you the superset of like all of them, right? It's kind of crazy, their model. Yeah. I actually found this to be one of the most difficult parts, I think, specifically for me, because while I was there, I was doing a fair amount of like sales, growth, first conversation, enterprise exploration, customer discovery stuff. And it was very difficult to both do that well and create like pull requests. So I could get to the point where I'd be like, oh man, like these people really, really care about X. It was difficult to like effectively turn that into things for people to see and keep a high rate of conversations going at the same time. And I think I reflected a little bit on that, because I think part of that was just being new to the code base. But part of that was also needing time to like distill that into, okay, here's what I think the user experience should be. Then, the team was really eager to grab those things and turn them into usable products. And so I oftentimes just, by the time that I had a moment to think, like somebody had already shipped something, and even if it wasn't exactly what I would ship, it was like close enough that you're like, okay, on to the next one.
So you would share something in like Slack, maybe it was like a team meeting, a team meeting, and there was maybe like a recording to go with that conversation you had with the customer, or like a transcript maybe, but you distilled it down to like the essential idea or the problem that they want, that they say like crafting defining the problem is almost like half the battle. So it sounds like you'd maybe kind of help really distill that. And then someone eager would jump on that. And before you know it, there's like a Vercel link to go play with some kind of experience that is one way to solve it.
Yeah. I mean, it did depend a little bit on like where we were in the cycle. I think one of the things that the Roo team did really well is that they were really intentional about, okay, what is the big thing that we are trying to get done, and making sure that got fed first, right? This is pretty standard stuff, right? Like if you're on a high functioning team, you have your big rock, you're trying to like get that big rock finished, and sure, other people might be working on other things, but that's secondary to the main focus. So that part is familiar, right? And usually those things were complicated enough that like one user conversation isn't going to shift it. But then there were other times where there would be, some smaller things or some things around the edges, or where like, yeah, absolutely. Like you kind of come back and grab it and go. And I did, I think as a PM, or, thinking about some, as a PM in the past, a lot of what you're doing is you're having customer conversation, you're throwing that into Slack, and you're saying something like, we don't have to do anything. Don't act on this immediately. And here's what this person told me, because what you want to do is you want to make sure the team is getting the same information flow that you're getting and facilitate that. But I actually found that to be one of the things that was hardest for me in trying to like matching their speed, is figuring out like, I know what that looked like for me at Stripe. And it was harder for me to figure out what that looked like at Roo. And I think that's part of what we'll all be recreating together over the next year or so.
It's super interesting, because I think like in the old world is you're being very disciplined about what you tell your team to build, because the engineering time or design time is precious. You want to make sure you have a very opinionated, like strategic take on, here are the biggest pain points, here's the goal that we're trying to solve. And in this new world, it seems like it's kind of like the opposite. It's like you actually have to exert the discipline to actually not take action right away, and you almost have to create almost like that. You have to put your energy into creating that thinking time to reflect and then kind of bring it back in a way.
I think the scarce thing becomes your user's attention and focus, right? Because you can throw too much chaos at a customer base or a user base such that they can't absorb it all. And there's only a limited number of things that you can email or DM or message, or tooltip. And so, and there were absolutely things that required disproportionate engineering focus that were expensive. And then there were a lot of things that were cheap too. And so I actually feel like it would be, and some of it would be easier if it all became cheap and that you could just change whatever you want. And instead it was like, whoa, man, half the time up is down, but sometimes gravity is exactly where I expect it to be. And yeah.
One thing I'm curious about too is so we talked earlier, you mentioned earlier how the designer is a very senior, or the product designer person is very senior and is focusing a lot on creating the design system that then other people can leverage. And so if we kind of continue this traditional versus maybe the way that an AI first company works, I've worked with extremely senior designers who are also really good at building design systems. And the way that that's worked historically is, you'll basically figure out when do you need to kind of extend the design system or introduce new patterns in a design system so that it can help you solve a new problem that you want to solve. So it's almost like making more Lego blocks or extending, creating more Lego blocks. And then the designers, the individual designers who are not the design system people's job in a lot of ways is to understand the design system enough to know when a new pattern needs to be created versus when it doesn't. And then you as the PM can trust your designer to basically leverage that. You don't have to think about it as the PM because that's all handled within the design team. So in this new world, is everyone contributing to the design system too, or is the design system maybe more of a treasured strategic asset that a smaller number of people are actively contributing to?
Yeah. So this. I'm going to move out of my experience with Roo here, and I'm going to speculate a little bit about what I think the future is going to look like. I do think that you will start to have I don't think it will be sacred, but I do think that part of what a great designer will think of themselves as doing is curating the design system that the rest of the team is using. And I mean, you to some extent see this already. I mean, what made some of the best designers I ever worked with were at YouTube or at Stripe. And what made them awesome is that 8 times out of 10, they were using the pattern. And the other 2 times they were building something new into the pattern that then got leveraged, right? By the rest of the teams. And I do think that that's going to become more core to the job. I also came away from it being I need to invest in my design eye so that I am better able. I'm not going to replace that person, but I need to be better at applying a design system because I'm likely going to be the person putting the first, doing the first 80% of that. And so I need to get better at it. Yeah.
The reason I'm asking is because I was kind of picturing, going back to you sharing the customer insights with the team and letting them know what you're learning. I was kind of wondering if there's almost an implicit expectation that maybe the very first person who might jump on it might be the designer to be do we even have a pattern that would allow us do something like that? And maybe so even though the team might not be ready to build it on the front end, maybe the person who's tasked with the design systems, the one that's thinking, looking around corners and trying to be if someone picked that up right now, they'd probably have no pattern to even there's no way to do this in the current system. I know we're talking kind of in the abstract because I don't know what the exact design system was there, but that's kind of the first place my head went. I'm curious if that's likely.
Yeah, I mean, I think let's take design systems out of this for a second. So at Google or at YouTube, if you want to launch something, you have an idea of how big the launch is. I forget exactly what they called it at YouTube, but there was like super high level that goes to the CEO, then there's major, which goes to the head of product, and then there's minor, which your like VP can sign off on. And to get that launch, you have to go through different approval processes. One of those is a design process. And like whether or not something gets adopted into the official design system, that there's a design lead that has to sign off, and they flip a bit in a system called Ariane. This is like an internal Google system. Hopefully Google won't come after me for talking about this. But they flip the bit, right? And you have to go through legal, and you have to go through whatever. Now, Google and YouTube are more structured than most places about their launch process. But implicitly or explicitly, like every single, some companies, they have like a launch review. Some companies, it just gets shipped, and then later they yell at you for not doing things, not telling everybody. Like, but it all exists somewhere. And so I do think that like a really high functioning team in the new world will probably have somebody whose job it is to look out for usability. And that person will probably build in some sort of choke point such that things have to go through them. And like where that lives is sort of arbitrary, right? Like it can just be informal, right? That like, hey, don't push it to production. It could be like specifically the pull request can't get merged until these 3 people say yes, or this one person says yes. Like you can kind of choose what you want that to be, but it's definitely going to exist. And where I guess what I came out of that being is like, okay, I knew that as a product manager at Stripe or at YouTube that I wasn't going to get anywhere if I was proposing things that it was impossible to build, right? Like I had to understand the systems. I had to understand the relative cost. And if I didn't have any ideas that could be launched in this quarter, like I was out of luck, right? Like they were going to find somebody who could come up with some things that they could launch like soon, right? And now I think there's going to be a sense in which, okay, you're going to be looking at customer problems. You're going to have some of them that are really big and like trajectory changing for the business. And you have some of them that are smaller, and it's going to be good for you to be able to take those things and break them down into something that can get in and that your colleagues can give you feedback on and you can make better. And then that will eventually ship. And I do think I think teams are going to have to rethink who do you ask to look after what types of opportunities and redefine those roles some.
If you're enjoying this conversation, please check out the links in the show notes to support the podcast. Mark and I do this out of love, but to keep it going, we also need your support. Thanks, and now back to the episode.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about like the example that Ben was giving, right? Of like, hey, like you have an idea, you have a meeting about the customer insights, and then you build a prototype. And I could also imagine a world in which, like the PM is the first one that builds that prototype. And as you said, they built enough of a good intuition about how to apply the design system that they can actually, it's more of like a push model, right? Where they'll be like, hey, like designer, I think this pattern feels a bit weird here. What do you think? Right. And then maybe that's how the conversation starts about creating a new pattern for that specific use case. Yeah, I think my guess is it's going to be a trial and error for a lot of companies. And also it's going to depend too on like the skill set and where different roles spike, right? Like a team where you have a very strong design-minded PM is going to be very different. One maybe it's like more engineering driven, right? And I think the checks are going to have to be different there. So yeah, it's interesting. But maybe,
I would also love if the coding just one last thought on that, Mark, is like, I really like what you're saying, because I would love if as the PM who's prototyping, like basically I'm assuming once you have a design system, you're telling your IDE or your coding agent only pull patterns from this design system. Do not introduce random new patterns from like the internet and open source like libraries to this. Like, let's use all the stuff that we already have, our existing Lego blocks. And what would be great, or what would be really interesting, is if the coding agent could like do that and only use existing Lego blocks, but also tell the user, hey, like this is probably not the ideal way to solve the problem you're trying to solve. It is the best way within the existing Lego blocks. So you might want to think about it. And then other times it might be like, this is like a 99% like satisfactory solution within the existing Lego block. So it's probably not worth, coming up with a new pattern for this. But that would be really interesting if the coding agents kind of helped people understand when the right time was to introduce new patterns.
It's almost like a visual eval or taste eval, basically.
Yeah,
that you can kind of just go back to.
Because there could be some principles that you always want coming through in the product. And like theoretically your design system and your design patterns should always like reinforce the the taste and like the culture and the values of the product. And so if it ever feels like this, you're trying to do something that actually is causing a rift to exist between what you want to be and what it is, and flagging it. But anyways, keep going, Mark.
No, just one last thought there. That I think that's where a lot of like really senior and really talented IC roles are going to go to, is like building those abstractions, as we were saying, like those design systems, or like that, like really like maybe backend components or architecture, but then also like writing evals, so then they can almost scale themselves too. I mean, not only you can just use my building blocks, but also you can get like my taste through these evals and like let hey, like this is you're going through the right direction, or maybe, hey, like I would never approve this because it looks like shit, and I want to pull up my hair if I see that in production. But yeah, back to the example. So we started, hey, like we're doing discovery. There's maybe you have a meeting, or depending on if it's a smaller change, maybe you're just literally a Slack thread back and forth. Then you're cooking, could take a couple hours or maybe a week to do like a prototype. And you share the prototype with the team. What happens next? And basically, like, where are we in the process too? Are we still like in the spec review, like old world? Are we like in design review? Like, yeah, where are we?
Yeah, so I have found it helpful to take a step back and be like, defining the problem, defining the approach, defining the solution. Like those things are always the same. I think by the time you have a prototype or a proposed solution, right? Because most of these things are actually working code. You're in the defining the solution stage. And I actually think this is one of the things that made, if I could go back and do this externship over again, I would be trying to do a better job going to people and saying, I'm asking for your feedback right now on if this is the right problem to solve. I'm asking for your feedback right now on whether or not this is the right approach to the problem. Or I'm asking for your feedback on the details of the solution, because it's three different things, right? It's like, what do you want for dinner? Do you like this specific restaurant? Do you want this meal? Like, what did you think of the meal? Right? Like and different feedback is useful at different times. And I think it was hard at points to know like where we were. And I think if I were a leader of let's say if you made me head of product at a company with, call it 75 engineers and 3 or 4 product managers, one of the things I would really be trying to bring is a sense around like, okay, which of these things are we talking about, and who needs to be involved in which of those conversations, so that all of us want to be able to like work and get things done with some level of autonomy, and then all of us work at companies that need to be able to like shape that autonomy in order so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And I think we knew what artifacts went with what, when I say define the problem, define the approach, define the solution, people are like listening are like PRD, design, software. Now you can have that whole conversation with the software if you want, right? Good. And in some cases, maybe you should, right? But not all, right? There were definitely, there were definitely times where all of a sudden we would be in a team meeting. I'll be like, oh, well, we got to pull back and write a doc, right? Which, felt weird with that when you have such a code first mentality. But engineers go through that too, right? Like, we need to step back and write an approach doc here.
Yeah, it's almost like the things that made for my favorite design reviews in my career, which is like when a designer sets the stage for the context for what we're even talking about, what's the problem they set out to solve, and then even walks you through multiple iterations of how they tried to solve it and what was wrong with each of those kind of, and then how they landed on like the best version, or like at least one solution that seems workable within the constraints. And then they explicitly call out, to your point, like, here's the feedback I'm looking for. I'm looking for this kind of feedback, this kind of feedback, and this kind of feedback. If you have this other kind of feedback, let's talk out of this meeting, but this is what I want to focus on. It's almost like that skill set is now becoming like the product review, or like the PMs will be expected and the engineers will be expected. Anyone that's introducing prototypes to the table will be expected to kind of be able to run a conversation in that way.
Ben, I'm so glad you brought that up, because design critiques were in the back of my head a lot. It felt a lot like a design critique, because you're actually pulling the product up and you're having a conversation about like what feels right, what feels wrong, what constraints, should we launch this now or later, what is the right ordering. And I think we should be willing to borrow things from other disciplines in that. We should, in some ways, I think the design teams often have a healthier culture around those conversations and product teams. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
And in this case, I'm curious how the design review went down with the prototype. Like, how did you? I know it sounds like it's still imperfect, and that's one of the things that you missed. But I'm curious, like, when you got out of a team meeting or maybe Slack thread, you're like, wow, that was awesome. Like, that was like a great conversation, intellectually honest. What did that look like and feel like?
Yeah, well, a lot of times that was actually happening like in comments on the pull requests in GitHub or in code review. Are you sure about this? Are you sure about that? Or a Slack message. And my feelings on that evolved over the course of the work. At first, it felt very most of the programming that I've done on my own. And so it was weird to get to the point where I had a pull request and then not be able to merge it. And so there was an adjustment around like, oh, wait a second, other people are going to have feedback on this. But over time, like, basically I started to see the pull request as the beginning of the conversation, not as the beginning of the end, right? And then you would start to get down, and oftentimes it got a lot better during that. I got really good feedback from people that thought about the product differently than I did, who thought about it better than I did in many cases. And so I suspect that will be common in the new world, and you'll be kind of managing which of these things needs to come to like a high bandwidth in-person conversation and which of these things can happen async. I think engineers are probably really familiar with versions of this conversation already, right? Like, this is already happening, has been happening for years in GitHub, where people are arguing about implementation details in the comments of a pull request, right? And now all of us are going to get that joy on some level.
Yeah, it's so interesting because like it almost feels like you're going through the exact same process for every single step of that 3-step product process that you described, right? Like you're pushing a pull request, right? Then you're getting feedback, and then you kind of go back to the drawing board. And then kind of once you feel like, hey, like we converge on kind of the feedback here, then we move to the next step. But it almost feels like what changes is super abstract, is like the altitude of the conversation, but like the mechanisms to have that conversations are the same, which now I feel like I finally internalized like why this is so confusing. Because like unless you're very explicit
let me make it one layer more confusing. All right. So as different as design and product and engineering are, we do share a common language around how to ship software together. Now, let's imagine a world where the exact same tools are available to customer support or to a relatively junior marketing manager, right? Or whatever. How do you manage that? At least in a product design engineering world, we sort of understand that different types of product changes are going to have different bars for who gets to say yes. And if it can really sink the business, the CEO is going to want to weigh in. And if it's a major change that's going to affect like the look and feel for 90% of the customer base, the head of design is going to have some, like, we know that, we're used to that. I mean, I do think there are going to be teams where customer support is going to be creating pull requests and around customer feedback. I think that's probably on net a good thing, but then someone has got to catch that and decide, okay, is that strategic? And it kind of inverts like you're used to kind of having as a PM to go out and like the great PMs, right? They're friends with the support people. They're like reading the threads, they're deducing that, and they're coming to these team meetings and be like, did you know that we're radically underserving this one customer type? And you're like, God, like, I can't believe you spent that much time crawling through intercom and like to get those nuggets, right? I got to be more like you. And that might all of a sudden just be like landing in your engineering team's work stream, right? And you actually might be the first line of defense against that, to like sort through and be like, which of these should we pay attention to and which of these should we not, right?
Yeah, that kind of like a super random tangent, but my brain just made a weird connection, is that actually could be such a cool way to figure out like which people in customer success could be a great PM. Like, let's say they actually like read all those support tickets and then do a pull request, submit it, and all of a sudden you see all these metrics move up and to the right because this person made the change. Like, and that happens more than once. And there's something that person might be doing that is working that might make them a really good fit to then kind of move to that part of the org.
I
So
mean, this is literally why because I came into product management through the customer support org, and I remember putting together this like whole plan of this internal tool that we needed that would allow us to like, resolve things on our own without needing engineering resources. And I had to like pitch it, and it had to compete with like actual core product priority stuff, which obviously didn't get funded. And yeah, I mean, I think that if I had these tools back then, I would have been able to hack together my own like internal tool for solving problems, but it would have only been one step further for me to actually go in and solve some of the problems that I was seeing. And obviously I did find my way into product management. So that theoretically would have been a potential predictor of people that, I'm not going to say I'm a good PM, but people that are at least interested in exploring product management. I think that would be a good.
Some of the best PMs I've ever worked with have come out of customer support teams. Like just in terms of crushing the user empathy and seeing around corners. And I think it's absolutely a place where oftentimes when I'm coaching people that are trying to get into product, I'm like, just find a company you like, find users you like, join their, I tell them to do exactly what you did. Find a problem that nobody else knows and then pitch it to a PM that's friendly to you. But now, yeah, I mean, look, I do think, the hard thing, if you really think about the things that have been in your backlog from customer support, there's a certain number of things that would get fixed if only an engineer had time to look at it. There's a certain number of things that are like straightforward to fix, but then usually the things that stick around for like a really long time, there's like some other constraint that like, oh, if we change this for this user type, this will break for somebody else, or this is in some way intentional, right? And that's when it gets really thorny, and that it was still not going to go away, no matter who you give a coding agent to, because those constraints will continue.
But you could make sure that when support and when customer success does have touch points with the product team, that they increase the amount of time they get to talk about that third bucket that you mentioned, which are the thorny things, the things that are features, not bugs, but they're still resulting in an experience for customers that feels broken or feels like not great. And then you can just not have to spend time on all the things that are like, yeah, there's like this word is mistranslated in Indonesian or whatever, so like just go fix it. Or there's this button that should be blue but it's red for some reason, or the contrast is off. Like if you just notice something being off that's blatantly wrong, then you should never have to like have a conversation to resolve those things. And I'll just add an asterisk on that, which is like, and Mark, I'm thinking back to our conversation with Adam Fishman on the podcast that we, some of our posts were very divisive for some people who are like, yeah, like customer support can like ship PRs and it's great. Like everyone should be empowered to contribute to the code base. And there's this other group of people that are like, yeah, but that's just like, everything's going to become garbage in a world where like everyone in the org can just like ship stuff because you have no centralized decision-making or gatekeeping on like the experience. And so the asterisk I had in that post is the asterisk I'm going to reintroduce here, which is like, we do need those kind of systemic guardrails within the tools so that there is an existing design pattern that people can use. There is a well-established kind of review process for people to, maybe review the PRs before they go live. And I think the empowerment of people to ship all these PRs will be a forcing function for new workflows and new patterns to emerge, and how teams consider bringing those changes into the code base. Like, I don't think what we have today from like the state of the art on like PR reviews is going to be the state of the art of PR reviews in like 3 years or 2 years, maybe even 2 years, because the pressures are just going to mount to the point where people are going to have to find a new way of doing this stuff. So anyways,
one of the things that Roo Code offers is a agent that does automatic code reviews on every pull request. And I do think it's going to be heavily mediated by AI, and that's going to be one of the things. And I think you're totally right. I do think there's going to be a set of like guardians of the strategy and of the core experience. And then there will be a lot of people that can suggest what can go in. And I think if people take a step back, what they'll realize is that already exists today. If you are like a junior engineer at Meta, you're not like changing the Instagram algorithm, right? Like without somebody else, you might accidentally break something, but you will if you do that repeatedly, you will get in trouble, right? For the rest of it, they have a process, right? And I think that process includes decision makers for various changes, so we already have some of that, but it does. Look, I think if this is done correctly, we'll have more conversations about prototypes and about what the experience should be like, rather than about the like
Work about work.
Yeah, work about work. Yeah, exactly. And I think leaders at, this, I'm assuming, based on my experience with the super community, that we've got some pretty senior folks out there. And if you're a leader at a tech company, it's incumbent upon you to kind of like steer your team through these conversations and like tell people, okay, things are changing. We're going to be experimenting. Here's what that's going to look like. And like make it okay to talk about some of these friction points, because it's not there. Otherwise, it can be a really negative experience, and it can come across as like only I should be able to make these decisions and you can't, right? Like we all know that there's status hierarchies within companies, and I think you want to guide people through that in a way that respects the user and the business, but then also treats people with equal significance.
Yeah, as we're talking to these, I'm like, oh man, I think there's a lot of abstract ways in which we work or we make decisions or we get approval that I think are going to stay the same. But the way the work gets done, the way we track work, the way we like interact with each other is going to like change a lot. I'm like thinking about like all these like productivity tools. I'm like, those feel like they're going to, if what you're describing is the future, those are going to be either have to be rebuilt from the ground up or they're going to disappear, which is super, super interesting, like the Linears or the Asanas of the world, which is, yes, it sounds pretty scary. But I think where I want to go next, I know we'll have a lot of time, but one is like, do we cover the entire process end to end? And then the other thing that I'm thinking about, right, when I think about the different ways of working, I keep going back to like the analogy of like being a remote company versus being a hybrid company versus being, in person. And I would love to touch at some point of like, hey, like, do we think like if you're like a, old school company, can you go back to work the way we're working, something like Roo is, or do you kind of have to scratch? You have to start like from scratch and really just like start with like AI native mindset. But anyways, before we jump there, let's maybe talk about like, is there anything else in the product process that we didn't cover that you think is worth highlighting?
I think we got it.
Sweet. Yeah.
So Roo is remote?
Roo is remote. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'd love to hear your reactions to Marc's. That was an interesting set of questions, Marc.
Yeah, but my point is more about like, it's less about like remote versus in person. It's more about like, can you adopt this way of working if you were not an AI native company from the beginning? Or do you think like it's just going to be really difficult? Because basically what I'm thinking is like people are going to listen to this, be like, whoa, like that sounds like, we're able to move much faster. We're able to have better conversations quicker. But I'm curious if it's like even realistic to get there, right?
Yeah. I mean, I believe that the research on how firms work would say that actually it's very difficult for firms of different sizes to adopt new ways of working. And that normally what happens is they get competed out. I'd have to look at some of my friends are familiar with that academic research. I think that's actually what ends up happening in most cases. I think it's really challenging to be an established company at this moment in time. I think you can think of these tools at 3 levels. You can think of it for individuals, for teams, and then for orgs. And certain of these tools you can adopt as an individual. So I can use Cloud Code. As long as I can get it onto my machine, I can use it by myself. Okay, cool. My team can then adopt. My team might say, okay, we as a norm want to say that everyone in this group is going to bring prototypes built off of the code base. We're going to make sure everybody has access, and that's how we want to do it. And then orgs can go one step further and say, this is going to be our way of working for everyone. And certainly going from a world where PMs are responsible for PRDs, but not really supposed to touch the Figma, and certainly not supposed to make changes in the code, to one where a number of different PMs are going to be making changes like that is going to be challenging. This summer, while I was actually getting started with Roo, I read a book about the introduction of the machine gun to militaries. And I'm not really a gun person. I'm not a military history person, but I saw this book. It caught my attention. And as I was reading about it, I was realizing that like we're very much going through that moment. And the machine gun is introduced in fits and spurts between like the 1860s and 1880s. And it's not really until World War I where militaries adapt to the reality. And one of the reasons that World War I is as deadly as it is because you have people using pre-machine gun tactics against a machine gun. And so I won't spoil the whole book, but what I came out of it basically being like, okay, there's 4 things that have to change together in order to get a different result. You have the technology or the tools. You have the training. So people have to be able to use those tools to do things. You have to have the tactics, which is like the coordination of different people using the tools to get something done. And then you have the values, right? Which is what is important. How do we do our work? Who gets to say what, when, whose job is this? And with the machine gun, part of what happened is that prior to the machine gun, the goal was to get enough people to charge in order to break through so that you could split the enemy and overrun their lines and whatever. I mean, military history people, don't at me. But that was the goal, right? And the machine gun made that insane. You were going to die. Like, that was a bad idea. And one of the things that made World War I so deadly is that these generals literally had this drilled into them from the moment they started as like an 18-year-old until they're in their 50s or 60s. Like, they're not going to change at that point. And so I would put that out there for leaders. It's like, what are the tools? What's the training your team needs? What are the tactics? And then what are the values? And I do think people should be questioning, like, okay, when we talk about code review, what is code review for? When we talk about design review, what is design review for? And like, I don't have a crystal ball here. I don't know which of those things. I have some opinions about which of those things are going to stay and which of them are going to go, but I could be wrong about a lot of it. But I do think we are at a moment where we need to be building in some budget and some bandwidth to like go back to first principles and to think about why we're doing things, and then to talk with each other with intention. We're just going to have to build in some of that time, or otherwise we're not going to get the value out of these things.
You know what's coming to mind? So, okay, first of all, love the, I just learned something about the machine gun thing. I really like that. That makes total sense, I think, what you described. And where my head went as we're talking about this is two takeaways, or at least two thoughts. The first one is cultural and organizational change, I think, is probably most likely to actually take root and work if it comes from the top versus if it comes from the bottom. So if the CEO or if the president of the United States forced their generals to deal with machine guns before they get to the battlefield, like, they'll have figured out, like, they'll have been like, shit, like, I'm going to lose my job if I don't have a good answer to, like, what are we going to do about machine guns? So that's one idea, is like, if you're a CEO listening, or a product of CPO, VP product, you're a leader of some kind, and your team is not adopting the tools the way that you like as fast as you want, or you're not evolving the way you work as fast as you want, I would maybe take a look in the mirror and just ask, like, am I pushing as hard as I need to push to, like, make it, or am I modeling the right behavior? So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing is, given what you said about those generals not knowing, like, they've had a certain way of working ingrained and, like, deeply rooted in them. Even the general who's, like, trying to get ahead of the machine gun might literally not have any idea how. And so in our example, the product leader who wants their team to evolve, or the CEO that wants their team to evolve, but has no idea what that even means because they've never seen it. I'm almost wondering if, like, what you just did, this kind of like externship or internship, is something that, like, should a bunch of these product leaders take like 3-month sabbaticals and just go work at, like, AI native companies and just, like,
maybe
that's a great idea.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I do think that I understand why you say that top down. Certainly, if you're at the top of an organization, you have some ability to ask people to change that someone more junior in an organization doesn't have. But I would call out that, like, you're going to be constrained by the training that your people have, the tools that they have access to. How many tokens are you giving them? Are you giving them time to, like, try and do it differently and mess up and fix it? And then the values piece, I think often we are blind to. I think we are blind without even trying to be blind on the values piece. And because there are things that we don't even question about what makes a great PM. So I'll name one thing that I'm thinking about a lot, is that a lot of us that came up in a lean startup world would say, you should go and pitch before you build anything. Is that still true? I honestly do not know the answer anymore. I know that when it took me 6 weeks to get a clickable prototype that worked on dummy data, that was true. It takes me 6 minutes. Is that still true? I don't know. And I really don't know. And that's an example of a place where, like, my value, I may have had things ingrained into me through my product career that are no longer true. And we're gonna see in the coming phases about what those are. And so, but I do think leaders out there should be, but certainly if I were, the CEO of a company somewhere, I would be saying, we need to have a budget for experimentation here. We need to figure out what our process is going to be to run that experiment, talk about that experiment, and adopt it into our ways of working. And the best companies, Stripe had a value for a long time of edit Stripe. And so the best companies have, a nomenclature for this already. But if you're a leader out there, absolutely, this is something you should think about. Also, you should come and find me. I will absolutely have a conversation with you about this. This is one of the things I'm thinking about a ton right now.
I'm so glad. I think your two frameworks around individual use, team use, org use, and then the other one around kind of related to the machine guns, which was the training, the
tooling,
tools, the tactics, and
the values.
I think that's given me such a clear definition of what AI native means. And I think now I actually have a shared language to explain the disconnect. I think a lot of people are mistaking being AI native by either using the tools personally or maybe even thinking hey, if me and my team are using the tools, we're AI native. But actually, I think when I was referring to AI native, was I referring you kind of cover the entire spectrum. You're kind of it's your org, your team, individual. You have the values, the tactics, the training, the tools. And I think it's one of those things that you don't really know until you feel till you experience it, because it's and you maybe have to see the death. Unfortunately, I hope no one has experienced the death that we had to experience in the World War I. Yeah. That would be catastrophic, but it's going to happen in a metaphorical way for the people that are kind of saying no, or the companies that are not realizing that the multiplying effect of that probably is a conversation for a different time of what is the additional leverage you get from going from individual to team and to team to work. But anyways, just very grateful that you've dropped that framework, because I feel I have a great way to talk to people about it. And I think with that note, man, I wish we had another hour, because I think this is starting to get really interesting. But we have an excuse for a part 2 now. Two final questions for you, James. Where can people find you, and how can we be useful to you?
Yeah. People, so I keep a pretty regular blog at jdillard, JDILL.xyz. People can come find my writing there. And then I'm also podcasting a little bit, or it's a YouTube show called Dangerously Skip Permissions. And I'm thinking a lot about what it means to use AI as a creative tool or AI native teams, and would love to just have conversations with folks like you or people listening to this podcast. I've told people in the Supra community, if you're a PM leader and you want your PM team to get experience with some of these tools, I'm happy to coach you guys. I'll offer you a little bit of my time, or you just individually as a PM or a listener out there. Come and find me. We'll get an hour. I'll have you shipping code with Cloud Code in an hour.
Amazing. We'll make sure to link all those in the show notes. But man, thanks so much. This has been amazing. I'm so glad we made the time. This is a wrap.
Cool.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, guys.